What started out as a simple investigation into spin-down versus standard D20 numberings has somewhat ballooned into a massive mathematical deep dive into statistics, combinatorics, vectors, programming, and evolutionary algorithms, and I've been taking constant psychic damage for weeks. All of our dice are wrong, and I can prove it. Whew. Okay, that was a bit much. Let's wind back to where this all started. Broadly speaking, there are two types of 20-sided dice, or D20. A regular D20 has faces numbered so that every pair of opposite faces sum to 21, and neighbouring faces are otherwise as different as possible. I'm going to refer to this type of numbering as standard. A spin-down dice, however, is designed so that every value is directly next to its numerical neighbours, so that you can easily spin down from one value to the next. Such dice are used to track hit points in games like Magic the Gathering. But the question is, does this different numbering pattern affect if the dice is fair to roll? Does it produce the same probability distribution as a regular D20? This is a question that has long been discussed in the gaming space, and many people have tried to answer this question, mostly through empirical testing. They roll a standard D20 and a spin-down D20 50, 100, 1,000 times, and tally up the results. The trouble with this approach is they are rolling two different dice, which means they likely have different weightings. Even if you try to account for this, it's impossible to tell how balanced or off-balanced, and in what direction your two dice are, so you have changed more than one variable. So I wanted to take a different approach. Can we come up with a mathematical model for rolling a dice with different numberings? Now, the physics for rolling a d20 will quickly get very complicated very quickly. Wind resistance, friction, bounciness, angular momentum, it's all just too much. So let's try to simplify the problem. First, we will reduce the number of faces from 20 to 6, and then we will think one dimension lower, moving to 2D. Behold, a hexagon. Looking at a dice like this, it reminds me of another tool used for randomly generating a number, a spinner. If we think about our dice as being a 6-sided spinner with an arrow in the middle, instead of rolling a hexagon dice, we can instead think about flicking a spinner dice and seeing where it lands. Now, let's add one additional detail to our simplified dice model, the centre of mass. The centre of mass will affect the likelihood of a dice landing on any particular face. Essentially, the closer the centre of mass is to a particular face, the greater the likelihood of that face landing down. This is because as our dice flies through the air, it will be rotating about this centre of mass, rather than its centre of volume, which is directly in the middle. With a spinner, it's much easier to see that the angle made for a particular face will affect its probability, remembering that if the face lands down, then it's the opposite face which is the rolled result. Therefore the spinner numbering is flipped. So if I draw lines out from the centre of mass to each corner, we can see that each dice face has a different proportion of the full 360 degrees. We can do some trigonometry to find these angles, and as you can see, the faces closer to the centre of mass have a larger angle, and therefore a larger probability. If the centre of mass is directly in the middle of the shape, these 6 angles will be 60 degrees, and therefore each face will have an equal 1/6 chance of landing. This would be the case for a perfectly fair dice. If we bring in our two numbering systems, Spindown and Standard, we can calculate the expected result based on summing the probability multiplied by each face value. As you can see, when the dice is balanced, the average value is 3.5, which is what we would expect. And it's the same for both numbering systems, Spindown and Standard. However, if we move the centre of mass, something interesting happens. You can see that the expected values for our two numbering systems change, and depending on where exactly the centre of mass is, sometimes the standard dice is affected more, sometimes the spin-down dice is affected more. If we look at the average result for the two numberings across a whole circle of centre of mass locations, we get this interesting looking wave shape. The spin-down numbering has on average a much larger spread. It looks to be somewhere between 1.5 and 2 times larger than the standard numbering. This tells us that probably the spin-down numbering is more affected by the position of the centre of mass. But it does depend precisely where the centre of mass is, as if the angle is just right, the average is actually totally unaffected. This is the case at around 60 degrees and 240 degrees for the standard numbering, and around 150 and 330 degrees for the spin-down numbering. These two sets of angles being 90 degrees apart, which is interesting. These plot patterns should look familiar to anyone who has done some trigonometry. It's what's known as a sinusoid, the plot made by the sine and cosine functions. And for those of you in the audience who are familiar with the vector dot product, you may be able to see where I'm going here. But don't worry if you don't, hopefully you can still appreciate that this shape might give us some insight into how we could predict the impact of a particular off-balancing on our two numbering systems. If we return to our hexagon shape, we can think about this in a different way. Instead of a hexagon, what if we treated it as a set of 6 vectors, each pointing towards one of our faces? For those who aren't familiar with the idea of vectors, they are essentially mathematical arrows. They have a direction and a size or magnitude. In our case, the direction is towards each face, and magnitude we will set equal to the face's value. Now, let's put these vectors end to end, and then find the single vector which takes us from the center point to this end point. I'm going to call this the numbering's bias vector. Hopefully it's fairly intuitive why. It generally points in the direction of the larger numbers. Essentially, our hexagon dice is biased in the direction of this arrow. Looking at the bias vectors for our two numbering systems, we can compare their size and their angle. The magnitude of the vector for the standard numbering is 3.46, while the magnitude of the spin-down numbering is 6, and they are exactly 90 degrees apart. Now why are these numbers familiar? Exactly, these numbers perfectly match the amplitude and phase of our two sinusoids. We're really onto something here. It's worth thinking more carefully about the angle of the bias vector, because these two numberings we have discussed are just two of many different possible ways to arrange the 6 numbers. There are in fact 6 factorial, or 720, different ways to arrange 6 different numbers, but as we're arranging them onto a hexagon, we probably want to ignore all the rotations and mirrorings that are functionally the same. Doing that, we reduce our space to 60 truly different numberings. But if we're ignoring rotations and mirrorings, we might conclude that the direction of the bias vector is not actually that important, as we could simply rotate the dice. Remember, we have no way of knowing where the center of mass of our dice will be, and so we should probably optimize for all possible angles and distances, and if that's the case, the angle of the bias vector becomes irrelevant. What really matters is the magnitude or the size of this vector. We saw that before, the spin-down numbering had a larger spread to the standard numbering, and the ratio of this spread is exactly the same as the ratio between the magnitude of their respective bias vectors. Essentially, the smaller the bias vector, the less a given unbalancing will affect the average dice result. This opens up an exciting possibility. What if there is a numbering which is better than the standard? We said before that there are 60 different ways to number a hexagon, so let's try them all. Calculating the bias vector for all the different options, we get a surprising result. There are 2 numberings which have 0 bias at all. What does this mean? Well, let's try it and play around with the position of our center of mass. This is really cool. No matter where I move the center of mass, the average result is completely unchanged. This means if you were to use one of these numberings, it is essentially impossible to unbalance the dice. Well, okay, the variance does change, but the average stays the same. Now you might say this is not very useful, because who's rolling a 2-dimensional d6? Remember, this is just a mathematical simplification to hopefully gain some insight about larger dice in 3D. But also, this is actually useful, because these kinds of dice do exist. D6 pencils. So actually, if you want to make an unbalanceable D6 pencil, you should 100% use this numbering, as it guarantees an average result of 3.5. Okay, time to return to 3 dimensions and see if we can find the minimum bias numberings for all the standard polyhedral dice. Starting with the d4, the smallest dice. Interestingly, there is only one way to number a d4. Play around with it if you don't believe me, but that means we don't have any options to improve things. The bias vector for the d4 has a magnitude of 2.582. not great. Moving to the D6, the standard numbering has a bias of 5.916. The spin-down numbering has a bias of 5.196, but the optimal D6, which looks like this, has a bias of 1.732, about 3 times better. Interestingly, the way this works is that every odd digit is opposite to the digit 1 above it. If you're good at 3D visualization, you might be able to understand why this is, and therefore why the bias vector has a magnitude of exactly the square root of 3. Getting into D8s, I had to start writing some code to run all the options to find the optimal. But the standard numbering has a bias of 9.522, the spin-down numbering has a bias of 9.31, and the optimal D8 has a bias of... wait, no way, 0! There is a way to number a D8 to have absolutely no bias. In fact, there are 3 different ways. One where opposite digits differ by 1, another where they differ by 2, and another where they differ by 4. For reasons I will note later, the difference of 4 option is best. Amazing, let's keep going. The D10. Standard numbering has a bias of 12.539. The spin-down numbering has a bias of 18.58. And the optimal has a bias of 0.7082, which is a massive improvement of about 18 times better than the standard numbering. Interestingly, this doesn't follow the pattern of the D6 and the D8, but D10s are kind of weird, as they aren't platonic solids. For the D12, the standard numbering has a bias of 11.368, the spin-down numbering has a bias of 23.331, and the optimal has a bias of 0.18. Another one which can't quite get to 0, unfortunately, but it is 60 times better than the standard, which is great. The optimal arrangement here also doesn't seem to follow any kind of obvious pattern. It's just a shame because the D12 was my favourite dice, but looks like the D8 might have taken that spot. Okay, now for the D20, the big one. For all the previous ones, my code was able to check every single numbering pattern, because there were only up to about 8 million different numbering patterns for the D12. My code ran through them all in less than an hour. But the D20 has 40 quadrillion numberings. At the same rate, my code would be running for about 2 million years. So that wasn't going to work. I spent about 2 weeks trying to come up with a better way to find the best numbering, eventually landing on a simplified genetic algorithm. For those who are curious, I will leave my terrible Python code in the description, but in short, I finally got it to work. So, here we go. The D20. Standard numbering has a bias of 1.36. Hey, that's pretty good. The spin-down numbering has a bias of 64.301. Yikes. I should say, there are more than one way to number a spin-down dice, so this might not be the best spin-down numbering. Anyway, here we go. And the optimal numbering has a bias of, drumroll, 0. Oh my god, it is possible. You can make a perfect D20. It looks like this. And like the optimal D10 and D12, there isn't a clear pattern here, but it is 100% perfect. If you make dice, especially if you make dice with inclusions or funky cores, you need to start using this numbering pattern, as then you won't need to stress about making the dice balanced. Again, the variance of the dice will still be affected, but the average will always be the same. I will leave all the optimal nets in the description below. They are free to use, but if you can link back to this video if you use them commercially, that would be really cool. Okay, so, wrapping this up, what have we learned? First, if your dice is perfectly balanced, then the numbering does not matter at all. Second, if your dice is off balance, then the numbering does matter, and the scale of the issue can be quantified by looking at the bias vector, found by adding together all the value-scaled face vectors. A smaller magnitude bias vector is better, as it makes your dice more resilient to being unbalanced. Third, spin-down numbering generally has a larger bias vector, because similar values are close together. That means, in general, that off-balance spin-down dice are worse than similarly off-balanced standard numbered dice. Fourth, while standard numbering is generally better, it's not actually the optimal arrangement of numbers on any dice to minimize the bias vector. The optimal numberings have been determined and are all linked in the description below. Hopefully you've also learned a bit about vectors and how we can use mathematical simplifications to help solve more complex problems. This video is very different to my normal stuff, so if you want more maths videos, subscribing might leave you disappointed. My normal shtick is doing videos about my TTRPG system and the associated world-building project called The Verve. Don't worry though, there is plenty of mathematical intricacies to the TTRPG stuff too. I'd recommend starting with my dice system video linked here. For the maths nerds in the audience, as alluded to earlier, the relationship between the bias vector and the vector to its center of mass is a dot product. This is why there were two angles where any numbering was unaffected. This line runs at 90 degrees to the bias vector, and therefore where the dot product is always 0. The dot product in this case gives us a way of quantifying exactly how much unbalancing would affect a particular numbering, at least in terms of its expected value. If you are curious, I encourage you to look into this further, especially if you can come up with a good way of calculating the effect on the mean and variance of the distribution. I would also encourage you to investigate what the optimal numbering is that retains the spin-down property. I honestly think there is a master's thesis in this whole topic. And as a final disclaimer, there is another way a dice can be unbalanced other than having an off-center center of mass, and that is for the dice to be squished or deformed in some way. It is this kind of off-balancing that the standard D20 numbering is optimized for. See this paper. Personally, I reckon that off-balancing based on weight is much more common than squishing of dice, especially with modern dice with their fancy inclusions. But anyway, that's why the D8 I went for is technically slightly better, as it's more resilient to squishing as well. And finally, I need to thank my partner for not only dealing with me as I slowly lost my mind about dice numbering systems for months, but also helping me figure out the code when I got stuck. She is brilliant. And with that, I will finally, I've lost track. I will finally say, thanks for watching.